Good evening and welcome to a very short pamphlet. Tonight we are doing Why General Patton Was Murdered by Eustace Mullin. And I'm just going to go ahead and start. I read this earlier today and this is the third time I'm reading it. Enjoy this. In 1989, it will be 44 years since one of America's greatest heroes, General George S. Patton, was executed by his communist and Jewish foes. General Patton was struck down the day before he was scheduled to make a triumphant return to the United States. So, Patton was coming home the next day to fight the communists and Jews in this country. He knew it was behind World War II. That's my commentary there. Alright. He had just been removed from his command of the Third Army, which was in charge of governing the American sector of Germany, because he not only opposed the dismemberment of Germany, but also because he favored military action against the Jewish-led communists. As the most popular hero of the Second World War, Patton would have been unbeatable in a presidential race. And this is my comment to you out there. If you're a Palestinian or a white man, and you're trying to go through the system, you must expect that if you ever become effective the way that General Patton did, and he didn't plan on fighting the Jews, he woke up to them during the war, did. If you become someone that could pose a threat to them, you must assume that the Jews will kill you like they killed General Patton, like they killed JFK, like they killed Lincoln, like they tried to kill Jefferson. You must assume that if you are effective, will the Jews kill you. The Jews do not just kill to make an example of someone unless they are not yet in full control, like the Palestinian Mandate in 1948. The Jews will only use terror against random people if the situation demands, but if they're in control, they will only kill you if you are a real threat to the system and you won't compromise. If you want to fight the Jews, you must expect that they will kill you no matter how fair you fight. Jews will always revert to terrorism like they did against General George S. Patton. Moving on. As the most popular hero of the Second World War, Patton would have been unbeatable in a presidential race. This was the reason his skulking enemies ordered his execution before he could leave Germany. And they killed him the day before he was scheduled to come home to the United States, by the way. The Patton Papers from 1940 to 1945, recently published by Houghton Mifflin Company in Boston, give ample reasons for the murder of General Patton. A few months before he was killed, his driver of 5 years, Master Sergeant John L. Mims, was replaced. So he'd had the same driver for 5 years, and he's leaving back to the States to fight the Jews in a week. So, yeah, let's switch out his driver and have a truck crash into his Jeep. Yeah. Jesus Christ. If I were Patton, I would have locked myself in a fucking air raid bunker until my plane left and then prayed that the Jews didn't crash my plane, which they would have. Patton. So his driver was replaced a week before he is supposed to go home, and a few days after that, they kill him. But anyhow, Patton was asked by Major General Gay to accompany him on an excursion for a few hours the day before he was to return to America. This is equivalent to a Jew gangster in Las Vegas asking you to go for a drive with him into the desert. You're not coming back from the walk through the desert, so let's go for a long walk. Okay. At 11:45 a.m., in clear weather and on a straight stretch of road, the driver of a GMC military truck turned his vehicle directly into the side of the 1938 Cadillac 75 Special Limousine in which Patton was being driven. Clear day, no traffic. They're the only two cars on the road. Big 7-ton truck just turns into Patton's side of the limousine the day before he returns home to America. Yep. Big coincidence here, guys. Anyhow. Patton was the only person injured. He suffered some internal injuries, but did not seem to be seriously hurt. Yeah, that didn't stop the Jews from giving him one of those syringe air bubble heart attacks that Mossad specializes in now. So on December 21st, 1945, it was announced that he had died of an embolism, which is an air bubble. Like the ones they fucking inject into your goddamn blood vessels near your heart. That is a bubble of air in the blood which is fatal when it reaches a vital organ. It can be introduced into the bloodstream with a syringe by anyone with brief medical training. The Mossad uses this to kill people all the time. Anyhow, Patton was a vigorous 60-year-old with enormous reserves of energy, who seldom needed more than a couple hours of sleep a night. Not only did the U.S. Army make an investigation into the quote-unquote accident which had put him in the hospital, but no questions were asked about his so-called embolism, or his air bubble of death. Just suddenly, no history of heart disease, just boom, air bubble in the heart. He's dead after the accident failed to kill him. On previous occasions, when attempts were made to kill him, no investigations were made, despite the fact that he was one of the most popular and most powerful figures in American history. Come on. He recorded in his diary that on April 20th, 1945, while observing the front in his personal plane, which was clearly marked, a Royal Air Force Spitfire made 3 passes at his plane with machine gun fire, attempting to shoot down General Patton's plane. Then the Spitfire, after 3 passes, went out of control and crashed. The story was later put out that a Polish flyer had been piloting the Spitfire. Patton was not injured. How much you want to bet that was a fellow Polish person? With triple parentheticals there. So literally, a British plane tries to shoot Patton out of the sky 3 times. And then after they failed to shoot him down, and other people saw what was going on, he's just like, oh crap, I didn't mean to shoot at General Patton's observation plane. Shit, I'm just out of control, I'm going to crash now. Bullshit. Patton's military exploits were such that he was the only American general whom the Germans feared. They transferred entire divisions as soon as rumors were spread that he was on a given front. The Germans' contempt for Patton's fellow generals was shared by himself, as he proves on many pages of his diary. During much of World War II, Patton survived repeated efforts of his fellow generals as well as the British leaders to get rid of him. In 1943, when he had turned the tide in Africa with his brilliant victories at Gafsa and Gela, Patton was removed from command after Drew Pearson printed a story that Patton had slapped a malingerer at a field hospital and called him a yellow-bellied Jew. A malingerer, by the way, is someone who feigns illness or injury to get out of combat or deployment or pretty much any type of military activity. This is something the Jews are famous for. Actually, the Army manual in World War I and World War II, the Jews raised a stink about the drill instructor manual for the Army saying, beware of Jews, they'll pretend to be hurt, or they'll pretend to be sick when they're not really sick, they're just trying to get out of it. So Patton bitch-slapped a Jew that was pretending to be sick in a field hospital that was full of men that were actually hurt, and so Patton bitch-slapped this Jew and called him a yellow-bellied Jew. And the Jews crucified Patton because of this with their control of the media. It's fucking based. Based Patton, you yellow-bellied Jew, and just open palm bitch slaps this Jew. Gotta love General Patton, God rest his soul. Moving on. Eisenhower used this incident as an excuse to refuse Patton command of American ground troops in England, giving the command instead to Omar Bradley, whom Patton exposed as a cowardly dullard. We will never know how many casualties Bradley's cowardice and incompetence cost us, but it must have been many thousands. Well, that's conjecture, but whatever. Patton wrote in his diary on January 18, 1944, quote, Bradley is a man of great mediocrity. At Benning, which is Fort Benning, an army base, in command, he failed to get discipline. At Gafsa, when it looked as though the Germans might turn our right flank, he suggested we withdraw our corps headquarters to Furiana, and I refused to move. So Bradley was a bitch. He was an armchair general that always tried to retreat way before it was time so that he didn't risk getting his butt, scratched. He's a coward. But the Jews presented Bradley as the fighting man's general. The Germans saw right through us. The Germans knew that the Jews were trying to prop up Patton's peers, because Patton would actually go to the front line and do low-flying reconnaissance flights and stuff over the front line. And, that's why Patton was so popular, because the guy had balls the size of grapefruit. Patton cited numerous other examples of Bradley's cowardice. As for Eisenhower, his references to him are always contemptuous. Patton refers to Ike as divine destiny, but more customarily as a fool. On March 1st, 1944, Patton noted in his diary, "Ike and I dined alone and had a very pleasant time. He's drinking too much." And so Eisenhower, according to Patton and many others, the Jews kept control of him with booze and whores. And you're going to learn here in a little bit where Eisenhower was actually sleeping with a shiksa from England that was actually a member of the British intelligence services. So, in other words, she was in the employ of the Jews. Moving on, Patton was extremely disgusted with Eisenhower's infatuation with his quote-unquote chauffeur, Kate Summersby, and he persuaded Ike not to divorce his wife Mammy in order to marry her. Kate Summersby was a British intelligence officer who had been ordered to prostitute herself to Ike so that he would send American troops into the line instead of the British. England had experienced such a terrible bloodletting at the hands of the German armies in World War I that Churchill and other British leaders determined to sacrifice Americans wherever possible on the Western Front. And we know now Churchill was in the employ of the Jews. The Rothschilds bought him his first uniform during the Boer Wars and then directed him to commit genocide along with many others against the Boer people, having Churchill, among others, put ground up glass into the food of the Boer, whose land that had gold and diamonds on it the Jews wanted. Moving on. Although Kay Summersby secretly despised Eisenhower, she was a loyal British subject and she successfully carried off their affair. It was estimated she cost the United States 100,000 casualties, which otherwise would have been borne by the British. Okay, that's conjecture. They should have left that out, but oh well. Patton had noted on his diary July 5th, 1943, before his successful African campaign, quote, "At no time did Ike wish us luck or say he was back of us. Fool." End quote. On July 12, 1944, Patton wrote in his diary, quote, "Neither Ike nor Bradley has the stuff. Ike is bound hand and foot by the British and doesn't know it. Poor fool." As a result of Patton's bold advances in France, Field Marshal Montgomery persuaded Eisenhower to issue one of the most amazing military orders in history. All the Allied armies must advance exactly abreast, and no one, meaning Patton, would receive undue credit. Throughout the war, Patton achieved his amazing victories by being in the field, whereas the other generals remained far behind the front in their dugout, so-called headquarters, or in the luxuries of villas far from the sound of gunfire. So towards the end of the war, as his letters home indicate, Patton knew that Jews were behind communism, and Patton had decided to save the German people from the genocide the Jews were planning to commit, and did commit, unfortunately, after they killed Patton. By 1951, something like 11 million Germans had been killed in peacetime, so-called peacetime post-World War II Germany, by Jews in wearing the uniform of American Army officers and Soviet officers. So Patton was trying to save Germany from the fate of 1917 to 1933 Soviet Union, which was mass genocide at the hand of Jewish genocidal maniacs who killed everyone who had a brain or didn't toe the line. So Patton was pretty much trying to be Jesus to the Germans after Hitler. Moving on. During a press conference on May 8th, 1945, Patton was asked, "Would you explain why we, the Americans, didn't go into Prague?" And once again, this is the Jews trying to keep Patton from occupying territory that was designated for the Jewish-controlled Soviets. And, looks like my battery might die before I finish here. I'll move on. "I can tell you exactly," Patton replied. "We were ordered not to take Prague." Patton wrote to his wife on July 21st, 1945, "I could have taken it," referring to Berlin, "if I had been allowed," end quote. He would have saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of German women if he had, by the way. But the Jews, including Churchill, Churchill's controllers did not want that. Eisenhower's refusal to allow Patton to take Prague and Berlin, holding him back while the Soviets occupied these crucial capitals remains one of the greatest performances of treason since Benedict Arnold, like Eisenhower, sold out to the British. Patton apparently was writing his own death warrant when he entered his frequently voiced opinion in his diary on May 18th, 1945, concerning the advisability of fighting the Soviets. Quote, "In my opinion, the American army, as it now exists, could beat the Soviets with the greatest ease, because while the Soviets have good infantry, they are lacking in artillery, air, tanks, and a knowledge of how to use these combined arms, whereas we excel in all three of these. If it should be necessary to fight the Soviets, the sooner to do it, the better." And of course, the Jews wound up giving the Soviets the fission and then fusion hydrogen bombs. So once that happened, it was too late to try and drive out the commies, which were, of course, 80-90% of the spies for the Soviet Union before the fall of the Soviet Union were Jews, as our State Department was full of Jews that were spies for Israel and the Soviet Union. The danger which Patton presented to his enemies was not merely that he was a great American patriot. He was also impervious to any sort of undue influence, and Pierce had stated at certain times that anyone that's in politics or the military high up is controlled. They have them fucking children on tape or something like that, or something where if they ever stopped doing what the Jews wanted, they would just have to show a few tapes and they would no longer be a threat to the Jewish power structure. Moving on. So he was impervious because of his personal character. He had married Beatrice Ayer, one of the wealthiest women in America. This made him financially invulnerable, and he was happily married, which made it impossible for him to succumb to the blandishments of foreign agents such as Kay Summersby. And that's the thing, if you're getting into this, if you're running for office, or you're just starting out in the Jew naming business, do not sleep with women. Like, you have to, really vet a woman before you sleep with her, especially if she, comes onto you. You'd be very wary. It's a trap. Anyhow. And it's not always the case, but you have to assume it is 100% of the time. General Patton opposed Jews and communists, not only because they were enemies of America, but because they were a lower order of human beings. So for the most part, Jews don't have a conscience or a sense of shame or guilt. So I agree with that for the most part. He refers to the fact that the Soviets were Asiatic, devoid of feeling for human life. Shortly after he was killed, he wrote in his diary on October 1st, 1945, quote, "The Jewish type of displaced person is, in the majority of cases, a subhuman species without any of the cultural or social refinements of our time." In other words, they're antisocial. I agree for the most part. Patton was removed from command in Germany because he actively opposed the swarm of locusts, in other words, Jews, such as the recently recruited Soviet agent Henry Kissinger, who fought Patton to win control of the military government in Germany. Yeah, Henry Kissinger was brought in because Morgenthau wanted a Jew there to complete the genocide of the Germans that Patton was never going to carry out. Because Patton pitied the Germans and knew that they had obeyed the Geneva Convention, unlike the Jews in Soviet uniform that were the military officers in there. And, they needed a Jew there to cover up the crimes being committed by Jewish officers in the rape of Germany after World War II. Let's see. In his diary, on August 29th, 1945, Patton wrote, "Today we received a letter in which we were told to give the Jews special accommodations. If for Jews, why not for Catholics, Mormons, etc.?" End quote. Reasonable question. Why do the Jews have to get special treatment? This is before the Holocaust myth was being perpetuated, by the way. But they were telling people that they found a bunch of lampshades made out of Jews at Auschwitz, so that was the propaganda of the day. That was the extent of the Holocaust propaganda at that point. On August 31st, 1945, Patton wrote to his wife, quote, "The stuff in the papers about fraternization is all wet." Fraternization is you're not allowed to become friendly or become familiar with prisoners or your subordinates. So fraternization is referring here to becoming friendly with German prisoners. All that sort of writing is done by Jews to get revenge. Actually, the Germans are the only decent people left in Europe, end quote. And, well, there were good Frenchmen and stuff, too. I mean, there were a lot of Vichy French that helped fight the Jews during World War II, but that's hyperbolic. But, yeah, the Germans fought almost to the last bullet in World War II, knowing that the world the Jews would bring after the defeat of the Germans was going to be worse than hell, which it was for the 11 million Germans killed after World War II ended by Jewish officers in the U.S. Army, the British Army, and the Soviet Army. Moving on, Patton noted in his diary on August 31st, 1945, quote, I also wrote a letter to the Secretary of War, Mr. Stimson, on the question of the pro-Jewish influence in the military government of Germany, end quote from Patton. As a result of Patton's opposition to the Kissingers, who believed they had won the war